Hello and welcome to Finally Got Around to. Today's video is going to be a little bit different. Normally I do talk about video games, but today I'm going to be talking about tabletop RPGs. If that's something that interests you, keep watching. If that's something that doesn't interest you, I got tons of video game videos, video game articles on my website. You can go check those out as well. But today I wanted to take some time to talk about tabletop RPGs that I want to play that aren't Dungeons and Dragons. If you don't know, Dungeons and Dragons probably the most popular tabletop RPG. I don't know why I said probably. It is the most popular tabletop RPG, but there's lots of other very interesting games out there, and I want to take a moment to kind of talk about the ones that really have caught my eye and ones that I want to try. Find a group, play with my friends, whatever. There's a couple of them, so let's just jump right into it. So the first game that I want to talk about is called Root, R-O-O-T. It's Root, the tabletop role-playing game. It is based off of Root, a game of might and right, a woodland game of might and right or something like that. It's a board game, so originally was a board game. I actually haven't even played that board game, but I learned about this game, and it looks really interesting. I love the art style. I love all the anthropomorphized animal characters. That is something that is really appealing to me. I love animals. I think if I hadn't gone into writing, or I guess content creating, I probably would have become like a zoologist, someone that studies animals. So exploring these different kinds of characters and abilities is something that I have a lot of fun with. Anyway, getting away from the point, Root is a game that published by Magpie Games, who a lot of their games use the Powered by the Apocalypse system, which is kind of a different way to run games. Rather than using a 20-sided dice to determine things, Powered by the Apocalypse games use two 6-sided dice, and then a 10 plus is a success, or 7 to 9 is I think acceptable, and then a 6 or less is, or maybe it's a 7 and up is a success, but a 10 or more is like a particular success, and then a 6 or below is a failure. So you can roll the two dice, add them together. I've looked into this game. There are a lot of free to play, like, what's the term? This game has a lot of kind of like starting packets, I guess is a good way to explain it. There is like a specific term for it, but I can't think of it right now. Quick start, that's it. They have a lot of quick starts that are just like, you have a little town, there's a kind of a story going on there, there's pre-generated characters, and you just play as those characters. But the other thing about Powered by the Apocalypse is that it uses playbooks rather than classes. So it's a lot more customizable in a way. You pick kind of like a ranger is something that is in Root, the tabletop RPG. It's a lot different from a Dungeons and Dragons ranger, but you kind of have different plays that you can use, different abilities and powers, and you can also, as you level up, add to that list of abilities. And I think at some point you can even pull from other playbooks, but each playbook starts with their own set of optional powers that you start with. Root is also appealing to me because I like their system of creating a map. It's basically like you have a small woodland area, and there are different factions that control different clearings, which can be little towns or larger towns or smaller things or what have you. But there's lots of different interesting factions. There's the Woodland Alliance, who are kind of the local residents who are rebelling against the kind of larger factions that are causing this horrible conflict that's spreading throughout the woodland. The Eerie Dynasty is basically a dynasty of birds that have ruled over the clearings for a long time. And then the Marquisette, which is run by the cats. You can actually see the two factions right here. Basically a cat faction that is warring with the birds, and then the characters, the players, are just kind of individuals caught up in the middle and are trying to make their way in the world. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. There's also basically no magic in this world, which I think is kind of interesting to explore. I haven't played a round of this, I should say. I haven't played any sessions of this game. I've only read about it and been interested in it and wanted to try it. So yeah, that's that. I guess before going into the rest of the games, I should mention that I will run games for you if you're interested in playing games like this or even Dungeons and Dragons. Let me know. I have sites that I'll link down below where you could sign up to play in one of my games. Some of them will cost money, and hopefully that's worthwhile for you, but I've been a dungeon master or a game master for many years at this point. I've run all kinds of games, from single player games to 7-player games, so I have a lot of experience. If that's something that interests you, I also am interested in playing lots of these games, so let me know. We can make something work. But yeah, let's move on to the next game. So, also made by Magpie Games, this is Avatar Legends, the role-playing game, which is basically the Avatar The Last Airbender universe, but made into a role-playing game. For obvious reasons, a tabletop RPG that focuses on the world of Avatar The Last Airbender is very interesting to me. It also uses the same system as Root, powered by the Apocalypse, so it's kind of got a 2d6, two six-sided dice system where you roll two six-sided dice, and based on the combination of those numbers, you either succeed or fail what you're trying to accomplish. But what really interested me about this, and what has always confused me about trying to make some kind of game around this Avatar universe, there's so much creativity, and the show really does show that off in many episodes, that the characters can really do anything that their mind is capable of with their perspective element. And so kind of putting that into game mechanics is something that I feel like has always been very difficult to master. Like, if you're writing a rule book for how this game works, it's hard to think of every possible thing and think about all the different outcomes, all the different ideas that characters and players could have while they're playing. There's basically limitless creativity, which is interesting. Like, how do you assign different how do you assign a damage roll to earthbending? Like, there's so many different ways that it can be used. But I do think, having read some of the things about this tabletop RPG, I think they've come at it in a very interesting way. Rather than having characters with like hit points that are slowly taken away by attacks, there is more of a push and pull kind of system where characters can describe what they're doing. They can have a certain style of fighting, but in the moment they can decide what they are using their powers to do. And that kind of translates into more of like I'm pushing this person back, they're off their footing, they're knocked unconscious, they're, something along those lines. It's more of a status game than it is like a certain number of hit points. And I think that is a really great way to go about it, because it leaves the door open for players to get creative with whatever they want to do with their bending abilities. Or also, there are great options for players who don't want to necessarily be a bender of the elements. The other thing too, there are all kinds of different eras to play in. There's the Kyoshi era, which is a couple avatars before Aang in The Last Airbender. There's the Roku, who is the avatar right before Aang. You can also play in the 100 years where there, in quotes, was no avatar, where Aang was frozen in the water and the firebenders kind of started their campaign against the rest of the world. Then you can also play in the timeline where Aang is the avatar and is around doing things. And then there's also the Korra era as well. So it's kind of interesting to me that, like, it's just one world, but all these different timelines can all tell very interesting and different stories. And I like this because if you're playing in either the Aang era or later, it's not going to be easy to play as an airbender just because of the story of the world. But there is the Roku era and the Kyoshi era as well that you can much more reasonably play as an airbender. Yeah, so I'm very interested in learning more about this game, playing this game. So if that's something that interests you too, let me know. If there's any other, I'm really interested as well in the Powered by the Apocalypse system. So if there's any other great games that you know of that use this system, I'd definitely be interested to know about it. I know a couple of the other Magpie games like Masks that have gotten good reviews. I've heard good things about. So yeah, let me know what you're thinking. Then let's move on to the next game. So this is kind of an interesting one. I'm hoping that they don't copyright strike me for this, but you may be familiar with Critical Role, kind of one of the biggest Dungeons & Dragons creators out there. They've had their stream has been running for almost 10 years at this point, but they, over the last, I think maybe it was last year, they had an open beta for their fantasy RPG, tabletop RPG called Daggerheart. And it has its own unique system. It has a lot of different ideas. And I read through the stuff that they released for free during the open beta, and it seemed like a really interesting game. It's got a lot of interesting character choices, like you can play as a frog. I think that's everybody's biggest takeaway when they learn about this game. But in kind of a similar way to Powered by the Apocalypse, it uses two 12-sided dice instead of two 6-sided dice. But each of the dice has a certain special characteristic to it. There's the fear and hope dice. And so you can roll both dice every time you're trying to do something, but every time you roll, one of the dice is going to be higher. It's actually a critical hit if they show the same number. But for example, if you roll with hope, if you roll with hope, which means the hope dice is higher, then that gives you kind of a special bonus to what you're attempting to do. But if the fear die rolls higher, aka you roll with fear, then that gives the game master the ability to do something more, and also can have an impact on gameplay. So I really like that system. I think that's really interesting, and I love the potential creativity for storytelling that comes with that. And yeah, so I'm very interested in playing this. It's definitely among this list, probably one of the ones that's closer to the core idea of Dungeons and Dragons. But that's still very interesting. Oh yeah, they're talking about so I in another way, kind of how like Avatar doesn't really use hit points. This it does have HP hit points, but rather than like it being a specific number, you only take damage when the attacker rolls high enough on their dice, and it does a certain amount depending on how high that roll is. But then there's also armor, so you can choose to spend an armor point to mitigate some of that damage, potentially taking less damage. So it's kind of an interesting system, and I think it's a little more geared towards storytelling and kind of cinematic combat and cinematic experiences than having like, oh, I have 55 hit points and I take 12, let me do the math real quick. I think that while it has definitely worked well for lots of tabletop RPGs, I think this is a more interesting thing that I want to try out and explore and see how players react to. But yeah, just a very interesting one. There's definitely a lot of stuff about this out there. It didn't have like a specific trailer like some of the other things that I've been doing, but so I'm going to try to move on quickly. So hopefully this isn't like, I hope you don't copyright strike me, Critical Role. I'm a big fan. I hope you don't mind me using your video a little bit during my video. Okay, but moving on to the next one. So this is Forbidden Lands by Free League Publishing. When I was at PAX West a couple weekends ago, I was walking around the tabletop RPG booths, and I came across Free League Publishing, and there was a book that really caught my eye with the cover art, and I talked to the publishers and learned that this was called Forbidden Lands. It's another fantasy tabletop RPG, but it has some differences to kind of Dungeons and Dragons, the more common things that we know. I learned that the world is a lot more harsh, a lot less forgiving. The overall story is that the land was covered in a kind of a mysterious fog or mist, and then one day, while that was happening, anyone that was caught outside at night in the mist basically was killed by a monster. So people became afraid to go outside. But then one day, with no explanation, all the fog, all the mist just vanished. It moved. It pulled away to outside, to the edges of territory. So suddenly this whole land is, free and accessible, and people can walk around and be okay. And so that is something that people are adjusting to. The players, the adventurers, are the ones who actually go out into the world and explore, and that's kind of strange for people. Like, people are like kind of intimidated and frightened by the idea that somebody would want to do that, because they haven't really gotten used to this new version of the world. Also, this is the cover of the book that really caught my eye. This image right here. This guy like riding on some kind of dinosaur creature. I don't know. It looked really cool. But yeah, so I think the core concept is that like the player characters are these kind of survivalists, these harsh, not exactly heroes, more like rogues that are, making their way in the world and, doing whatever they have to do to do that. I'm very curious to learn more about this game and to kind of explore its world and its mechanics. I don't know, of these games I probably know the least about this one. They had I could have bought a kind of a core set of Forbidden Lands, but it was kind of a big box, and I only had like 2 small bags to bring with me on the flight home, so it wasn't gonna work out. But I am very interested in learning more about this game, and if that's something that interests you too, leave a comment, leave a like, and maybe we can learn more together. I don't know. But yeah, let's move on to the final game that I want to talk about today. Okay, this is Ink. This is a tabletop RPG published by Snowbright Studio. They don't have a video really that I can use for this, I think, so I'm just gonna scroll on their website. This is a very interesting one to me. I talked to someone at PAX West who was working at the Snowbright Studios booth, and they kind of told me all about how it works. It's kind of got a lot of roguelike elements, and after I read through the book myself, I noticed it also has some Souls-like elements, which is kind of interesting. I feel like those two genres have really taken over the video game space lately, but I haven't really seen it executed that well in a tabletop RPG yet, and I think that is something that could be really interesting to a lot of people. Basically, how it works is the player characters are characters that have already perished in some form. Maybe they're a character you had in a game of Dungeons and Dragons that was killed by a dragon, but now you are bringing it back in this game, Ink, which basically takes place in a sort of strange purgatory between life and the afterlife. And essentially, when you're creating a character, you need to have some kind of burden, something that happened during your life that is holding you back from progressing to the afterlife. And so it's very much geared on these kind of storytelling arcs, these kind of redemption arcs that characters can experience. And since you're in this world, death isn't really something that is too much of a worry. In fact, I learned that the only way that a party can actually level up is if there is a TPK, or a total party kill. And when that happens, everyone respawns at the latest area. There's little beacons that you can kind of like, every time you touch them, that kind of sets your respawn point. But once that happens, once all the characters are defeated by a monster, then everyone comes back there, and everyone gets to basically pick a new ability or two that they can add, a new power that they can add to their repertoire. So kind of making themselves stronger, not only by adding actual abilities and powers, but also you can attempt what you were trying to attempt again with more knowledge. So I think in that way it really does have a lot of roguelike elements. It's meant to be challenging. It's meant to be something that characters are going to charge headfirst into battle, and maybe it won't always go well. But the other thing that kind of struck me as kind of a Souls-like element was whenever a character is defeated, their equipment is all dropped in place, which is very Souls-like. So you have to go back to the place where you perished and find your stuff again. And basically, to the game master's discretion, maybe the monster that defeated you wants to hold on to some of your stuff, so maybe it won't be there when you get back, or anything can happen. But yeah, so I thought that was a pretty interesting little detail. It takes place, so this purgatory thing I've already kind of mentioned, it's almost like a bowl of this dark liquid, which is where the name comes from, like an ink. You don't want to touch it. It's very dangerous to come in contact with this stuff, but there are creatures that lurk in this liquid, sea monsters, if you will, and the world is kind of built up of small islands and places that float among this ink. They're called keys. They are constantly moving and changing, so there's no telling exactly where you're going to find those places again. So it's interesting. Going out on the ink is a risk, but might be something you have to do in order to escape. Another interesting thing, characters have a spirit and a shadow. The spirit kind of is what their character looked like in life. Could be, like a little dwarf like this guy here from Dungeons and Dragons, or it could be something else entirely. It could just look like a ghost or something. But basically the spirit focuses on exploration and social interactions and stuff like that. Meanwhile, the shadow, which kind of embodies the character's burden, the thing that is holding them back from reaching the afterlife, that is the kind of a more emotional response side of this character, that whenever there's danger, whenever there's combat, the shadow kind of takes over and can be a lot more aggressive. So I like that kind of dichotomy between the two sides of each character, and that kind of character background and story is built into character creation. I think that's pretty cool. So the game master is kind of inspired to use certain monsters, use certain enemies to encourage the character to follow through on overcoming their burden. And there's all kinds of different mechanics that go into play with that. But basically, it all builds up to a big climactic battle with a greater fiend that is protecting a passage beacon. And if the players are able to defeat the greater fiend and then come into contact with the passage beacon, that allows them to pass on to the afterlife. So it's a very interesting game. I think it's got a lot of interesting themes and ideas to explore. Definitely very different from lots of other tabletop RPGs. It's got a very interesting kind of cozy elements, but also definitely very dark themes as well. I should mention that there are elixirs that kind of give players powers if they drink them, and the book is full of all these little example elixir shops that are kind of just like, they look like coffee shops, and they have booristas, as you can see right here, barista that basically run the shops, make the elixirs. And yeah, so it's got a lot of cuteness to its dark themes as well. So I'm very curious to explore it, see how players enjoy it. If this sounds like something that's cool to you, let me know, and maybe we can put a game together. Yeah, so that's the 5 tabletop RPGs that I have been interested in playing over the last couple years, maybe, that I haven't been able to play yet, but I am definitely trying to make happen. So if that's something that interests you, definitely let me know. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Hit that like button, subscribe for more tabletop RPG content, or if you also like video game content, I do a lot of that too. So yeah, until next time, goodbye.